What is going on, guys? I hope we're having a great day. Welcome to another video. Now this video is going to be a quick one. I'm going to try and make it as quick as I can. It is going to be a tips and tricks video for anybody who is new to Call of Duty, casuals who are playing Call of Duty, who are trying to transition into at least getting a better edge or an experience in Call of Duty when it comes to their aim, when it comes to seeing enemies better. Basically just things that can give them an edge in these battles and give them an upper hand compared to other players who are using very high-end equipment, like very fancy mouse and keyboards, very fancy PCs. You got NVIDIA filters that PC players can use. You have scuff controllers that individuals are using that have additional paddles. But let's say you're an individual that does not have that kind of money, that doesn't have that means. You know, maybe you're a kid who is just starting out in Call of Duty. Maybe you're an individual who just doesn't have the means right now, who's very tight on the money, and they still want to improve in Call of Duty, but just don't have the ability to buy all of this fancy gear. So I'm going to make this video to show you 8 things that you can do when it comes to in-game settings, when it comes to settings on your TV or your monitor and on your controller itself to help you get that edge without, like I said, having to buy all of this fancy equipment. So starting with tip number 1, I want you to make sure that your controller is plugged in versus wireless. Now I know a lot of controllers nowadays, they are starting to get a lot more better. Even the stock controllers, right? You can run wireless. You don't have to plug it in. Now I'm telling you, when it comes to wired versus wireless, you're going to be seeing about a 4 to 8 millisecond input delay when it comes to being wired. So what I mean by that is anything that you are pressing on this button, if you are wireless or Bluetooth, there is going to be some amount of time that is going to skip in which that action is not going to register on the game. With a game like Call of Duty, it is a very fast-paced game. A lot of your gunfights, especially close-range gunfights, are going to be happening in a split second. So if there is certain actions that you need to do, such as shooting, aiming, turning left, turning right, slide canceling, basically pressing any button on here, if you are going to be delayed, at least these are the things that you can change. Get wired in, have faster input. Tip number 2 is make sure that your TV is in game mode. Now this is not for monitors, but this is for TV specifically. A lot of the older TVs, they're going to have different picture settings. These picture settings are usually named like general, theater mode, and then you have game mode. Now what happens with the older TVs is that when you try to connect an HDMI from a console to the TV, if it is not in game mode, there is a possible chance of additional input delay. So if you think about it this way, if you are trying to play wireless and you are trying to play with a TV that is not in game mode, you're having double the input delay. So if you feel like sometimes it takes 1 to 2 business days to shoot off your gun and you think it's going to be in-game lag, or it's like, why am I lagging? No, it might not be the game itself. It could just be your TV and your wireless input slowing you down. But if you do have a newer TV, you don't necessarily have to worry about this anymore because it does, I think it toggles this on and off automatically. Like it recognizes that what's plugged in is a console, so it's going to switch it to game mode automatic. You don't have to change it into the settings. Moving on to tip number 3 is to make sure that your controller is constantly updated as well as recalibrated. Now, if you have controllers like on Xbox, PlayStation, like Xbox Elite 2, if you go into the Xbox accessory settings, there is an option to update the firmware on your controller. Sometimes there are individuals who don't update the firmware at all, and what happens to that is when the firmware doesn't get updated over time, there are things that will malfunction on the controller. Maybe the buttons are having a longer input delay. Maybe some of them don't work as efficiently. So that's why I always recommend maybe every 1 to 2 months there's an option to manually check for a firmware update. And then I believe on Xbox you can also have an option to recalibrate your controller. So what that means is over time when you're using the sticks, when you're using the triggers, think of it as like a wheel alignment for your car. Over time, that wheel alignment is no longer straight, it is crooked, right? Or sometimes it can get crooked if you hit something or just normal wear and tear use. Same thing with sticks and triggers. You want to make sure that you recalibrate them. And I think the Xbox side, they have an option to recalibrate the sticks and triggers. I don't know if they have it for PlayStation because I don't own PlayStation. Moving on to tip number 4, and I think this is for specifically the new TVs instead of the old TVs, because the new TVs nowadays, they have an option to increase the contrast of that picture. Reason why you want to try fiddle with the contrast as well as the brightness is that if you increase the contrast on the picture, even though it might have an accurate depiction of the color itself, it's going to have an easier time spotting out enemies. So if you're playing in big BR or just in general, just trying to pinpoint what the enemies are and seeing the movement, because a lot of things in Call of Duty, the realism gets to the point where everything blends in. And PC users don't have this struggle because what they can do is most times they'll have this thing called NVIDIA of filters where they have their settings from the graphics card where it can actually change the filters on the game itself, but console players don't have that same ability. So without having to buy a $2,000 PC, what you can do is go into your TV settings and see if they have a contrast option. All right, and moving on to tip number 5, what I want you to do is go into your settings. I want you to go to controller, go into the button layout over here, because button layout, if you click on it, it's default, but if you can, go to button layout preset, change it to tactical. All right, tactical is a very good way with having the ability to crouch jump and slide cancel better on a controller by using a stock controller or one that does not have paddles. Because what you're essentially doing is you are switching the inputs from your B to your right stick. Now the right stick click is melee, right? And B is crouch. If you switch them, right? If you click on the right stick to crouch, that way you can sprint and you can move and crouch and slide without having to remove this finger off of the aiming stick, because not only this is going to be your crouch stick, this is where you aim. A lot of players who play on stock controllers are going to have that challenge and struggle of trying to keep the aim in their gunfights, because when they're trying to slide cancel and move around, they have to remove their finger off of the sticks. A lot of movement players who are trying to have that movement but using a stock controller and no paddles is going to have that struggle, because what they have to do is they have to take the fingers off of the aiming stick, click on B to crouch, so that way they can slide cancel and put their fingers back on B. Now you can either do tactical, or with your finger positioning you play claw, but I think claw is more of an advanced movement. So an easier way to do that without having to buy paddles, without having to play claw, you can switch to tactical layout. All right, tip number 6, guys, I want you to go into settings again, go into interface. Now interface, I want you to go to readability. Readability at the bottom, there's going to be color customization. Now if you click on this, go on to colored filter settings. This one by default is going to be set to none. What I want you to do is go to filter number 2, because out of all the filters, filter number 2 is probably going to give you the biggest contrast. Now on top of your TV settings, you're adding the additional contrast. You can also go into your in-game color filter settings, go on to filter number 2. If you notice, compared to filter number 3, filter number 3 has a lot of the colors blending in, but if you look at filter number 2, you're going to have higher contrast between the arrows, the background. Having higher contrast is going to make it easier to spot enemies in your gunfight. Last thing I do want to add is for your world color intensity down here, I believe your default is set to a 0 or 50. I want you to crank this baby up to 100, okay? And then moving on to tip number 7, same thing, go into interface, but instead of readability section, go into gameplay HUD. Gameplay HUD at the very bottom, you're going to see crosshairs. By default, it's going to say off. I want you to turn this bad boy on and I want you to set it to center dot. So with crosshair and center dot, what this is going to do is when you are hip firing or when you're not aiming down and you are just looking, there is going to be a little dot that pops up here. That way you know that where you're looking or where you're hip firing, you're going to have better accuracy because you can just use the dot to trace the enemy. Then I want you to go into show more here at the bottom, break it down, center dot scale. I want you to change it to larger, crosshair opacity to 100, and then crosshair colors to a color that is going to be very distinguishable for you personally. I've seen people use red, I've seen people use bright green, I've seen people use yellow. For me personally, I'm going to try out purple and see if that's going to make it easier for me to see where I'm shooting when I'm hip firing. And then the last one, guys, now this one is going to be for literally beginners, because for anybody who is trying to dabble with their controller settings, they don't necessarily know where to start when it comes to like sensitivity, their aim sensitivity, your transition timings, all of that. So let me give you my personal settings, something that you can start your base play on and you can adjust accordingly, because not all settings is going to be good for everyone. Everyone has different settings, but if you want at least some general direction, right, you can take a look at mine. Horizontal sensitivity, I stuck to 1.4, vertical sensitivity of 1.2. The dead zone inputs that I have set is on my left stick minimum 2, left stick max 75, and then on my right stick minimum 10, right stick max at 99, and my left and right triggers are both set all the way down to 1. I want you to go into aiming, go to sensitivity multiplier. My ADS sensitivity multiplier is set at 0.85. And then I want you to go to aiming advanced settings. Aiming advanced settings, ADS sensitivity transition timing, I set to gradual, and then my aim response type is going to be dynamic. So anyone who is really new to Call of Duty, everything that I just mentioned in my controller settings is going to sound very foreign, and that is totally fine. At the end of this video, I'm going to be linking a complete controller settings guides that I've already made. That way you can understand all the terminology that I just used and what that specific specific setting does to your controller. But if anything, guys, those are my 8 tips and advice that I would give to all players who don't necessarily have the funds to buy a fancy scuff controller, to buy a fancy TV monitor, to get a $2,000 PC to play on. These are the things that you can implement on your end without breaking the bank. These tips and tricks settings are going to at least help you pinpoint enemies a lot more easier in your gunfights and help out slightly with your aim in your gunfights when you don't have a paddle controller. But that is all I have for today's video, guys. If you did enjoy the video, please drop a like. It helps it tremendously to get this video in front of more viewers. And if you did enjoy the content overall, please drop a sub to the channel. My name is Pure Noble, and I'm glad that you're here. Have a beautiful day. Noble out.